this is a slightly different title from what's on the program, but I'm hoping I'm going to convince you that it does actually mean the same thing. But first, a disclaimer. I fully realize that the P in English is silent for this word, but my first language is French, where we do actually pronounce the P. So my native language center is saying, pronounce the P, pronounce the P, pronounce the P. But my frontal cortex is trying to suppress this and saying, don't pronounce it, don't pronounce it, don't pronounce it. But I'm a bit anxious right now because I'm giving a public talk. So I'm in flight or fright mode, and my frontal cortex is shutting down because, like Eden says, tunnel vision, that's what happens when you're in fright mode. So that suppression is not going to happen. So I'm going to be saying psychology throughout this talk. No, apologies for that. Having said that, I had the opportunity last year to analyze and review the Carry Dieback campaign, and in particular the messaging at the park entrances and at the boot cleaning station. I'm hoping everybody's familiar with the Carry Dieback issue and what we're supposed to be doing in order to not spread the disease. And what I found out was kind of made me reevaluate what I believed about how to communicate to others about what I'm passionate about and what I believe about writing in general. So I'm going to put a test to you, and I'm going to highlight a couple of myths about communication, and I'm going to show you a bunch of psychological models. And so here we go. So hopefully you've had a bit of time to have a look at these things. What do you think is going to be the more effective or the more persuasive in trying to get you to adopt a particular behavior, namely in this instance, staying on the tracks? Is it the perhaps longer-winded message on the left, or perhaps the clear bullet point-like message on the right? And just just have a think about it, and we'll see how we go throughout the talk. But yeah, have a think about it and think which one you think is going to be more effective. So the first myth in persuasive communication is that education is sufficient to drive behavior change. If we can just provide people with the right information, surely they will act or behave accordingly. This is the issue in the science of science communication called the information deficit model, in which we are the populace, the people are empty vessels, and the experts with the information can just pour this information or fill our knowledge gaps, and we will all be better for it. And yet, as we know, with climate change, for example, or unfortunately these last few weeks more and more on Twitter and Facebook, facts and arguments and counter-arguments actually lead to more polarization, and we become more and more entrenched in our respective views rather than coming to this sort of nice consensus. So it's the kind of assumption implicit in this kind of messaging, in my view, that if we simply but clearly state the facts of the matter, the trees are dying from a disease, the disease is spread by mud, and here's a picture of the issue at hand illustrating the problem, a dead tree, but please clean your boots, stay on the track, and she'll be right. It's kind of, yeah, nice, clear, straightforward. And yet, surveys show that although issue awareness might be high, people understand or know about the issue, compliance at the boot stations is unfortunately quite low. So something's obviously not working. And Australia has a very similar issue, has been grappling with a similar issue for over 10 years. Same thing, education, awareness campaigns, high level of awareness, not necessarily lots of compliance. So it's not working. Number two, myth number two, is that you know why you do the things that you do. You know what motivates you. We understand, or we think we understand, what drives our behavior. I mean, let's face it, we're rational human beings. You'd think we'd have some insight into what's going on in here or in here, when our guts, wherever you think your thinking is. But unfortunately, I hate to spoil it for you, but we don't. We think we're rational, but unfortunately we're not. So Can you remember, for example, when hotels or motels started asking us to recycle our towels to help them save the environment? Yeah, it's all started happening. Okay, it turns out that was the least effective way to get us to recycle our towels. But the reason they used that message is because they asked us, what do you think would get you to recycle your towels? And what would you find convincing? And so when you ask people, what do you think will motivate you to recycle your towels? They say, oh, well, if you include, if you say that if I recycle my towels, that's helping you save the environment. Yeah, I think that's pretty compelling. I'd agree with that. But on the other hand, if you tell me to recycle my towels because other people are doing that, oops, where are we? Did I push something I shouldn't have? There we go. Is that going to start rolling on its own as well now? Okay. Yes, if you tell me that I should recycle my towels because other people are doing it, yeah, no, I don't think that's going to really work. And yet, after, ooh, what have I done? Stop. Anybody can tell me how I can stop it from... I forgot. Should I just exit? No.
You talk, I'll just flick it back if it does it again.
Oh, okay. Right, so this is... oh, no, you can... Okay, I'll be fine.
Okay.
So social proof, as this is called, or social norms, are very powerful, well understood, but actually underestimated, or certainly we're the last, as I said, to know it ourselves. We're completely unaware of it. But the greatest predictor of whether you will actually do something is whether the people around you are doing that very thing. So be the change you want to be in the world, model the behavior, or at least emphasize the fact that the majority of people are doing it, if it's true. So maybe one of the first things we could do for our messaging here is to, instead of using the fact of the matter of the dead tree, is to swap it out for a nice, friendly picture of a like-minded person doing the very behavior that we're trying to encourage. That would be one way to do it. So more education doesn't work, unfortunately, and relying on our intuitions, or on park managers' intuitions, or on people's intuitions of what might motivate them to change their behavior doesn't work either. So, and if you devise a campaign based on what people tell you will change their behavior, it's going to be wrong. So what does work? Maybe this. Not use that button. So you're going to use salient beliefs and with thoughtfully processed. You're going to create a message based around a more specific, relevant belief, and you're going to deliver it in a way that encourages effortful thought. Let me give you an example. Basically, what's going on before you even decide to do something, or to carry out a certain behavior, is all these other things. It's amazing that we actually get anything done. There's all these essentially voices in your head, that's what they are, telling you, what do I think about this behavior? And if I do it, is that a good thing or a bad thing? What do other people do? What do other people think? And what do I think about those people thinking that thing about that behavior? And can I do this thing? And are there other obstacles or barriers in my way of performing that behavior that you're trying to get me to do? So based on this theory of planned behavior, that basically is saying that there's a whole bunch of different types of beliefs that go into whether you decide to have an intention to do something and to eventually do that very thing. You need to go out into the field and carry out a bunch of semi-structured interviews and find out what the most common beliefs people have about carrying out that behavior that you're trying to get them to do. And then you, with a bit of science, but not much, I promise, you're going to find what is the most distinguishing belief between the compliers, the people that are doing the thing, and the non-compliers, the people that are not brushing their boots, not staying on the tracks, etc., etc. it's all going to be a lot easier if I give you an example. Okay, so for example, instead of the usual typical protect our wildlife, don't feed the birds, which, believe it or not, those people that feed the birds, it's not because they're anti-environmentalist or they don't like wildlife. After all, that's why they're there, feeding the birds. So that generic belief in those warning signs don't work for them. Instead of which, if you identify that they believe that feeding the birds will eventually harm the birds because they're going to become dependent on humans, that's the belief that you can target in this particular message. Okay, so you've identified that belief, and now you're going to move on to deliver it in a way that promotes thoughtful processing. Thanks to this elaboration likely model, where when you attempt a message, you're either going to process it by a central thoughtful route or using peripheral cues where it's not going to make much difference. But if you use this thoughtful processing to engage with this message, you're much more likely to get a permanent change of behavior. So things that make this message more thought-provoking is a provocative title, some questions to arouse curiosity, some personalization, so the use of pronouns to put the person in the picture, my dog, some relevant evidence, things like your dog is cute, works very well, some stories, some emotions, personal norms, especially with environmental messages, that sense of encouraging people to do the right thing is quite compelling and persuasive. And all these are going to encourage engagement and thinking and make for much stronger, much enduring behavior change. So, result of the test, which do you think is going to actually end up working better to get people to clean their boots and stay on the track, more importantly in this case? Hopefully I've made a good case for it. And this is what I wanted to hopefully convince you of, to maybe bring some of your UX skills over to conservation endeavors. They're crying out for social scientists, if some of you are looking for more work. And also, conversely, that maybe some of this stuff can be applied to other things than environmental messages, for example. And I hope that I've convinced you that more education doesn't work, relying on other people's intuitions about what motivates them doesn't work, and longer, clear, plain English language does work, but it's not sufficient. It needs to be much more than that. Et voilà. Thank you.